The man didn't even look up from his cards when he said it. Colton Vane leaned back in his camp chair, fingers wrapped around a tin cup, and said it loud enough for every man in earshot to hear, "Someone ought to tell the widow to turn around before she embarrasses herself further." The laughter came fast. 6 cowboys, weathered and certain of themselves the way men get when they've never been wrong in front of each other. One of them, a thick-necked man named Burl, actually stood up and started clapping, slow and mocking, as Evelyn Hartley crossed the open ground toward the camp foreman with her hat in her hands and her boots leaving straight tracks in the dust. She didn't run. She didn't flinch. But her jaw tightened in a way that a person only learns after they've had to swallow too much for too long. She was 21 years old, a widow of 4 months, and she needed this job more than she had ever needed anything in her life. That was the whole of it. If it were you standing there, hat in hand, laughed at before you'd said a single word, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this one move you, if you've ever had to prove yourself to people who'd already decided what you were worth, then hit that subscribe button and stay with us. Drop your city and country in the comments below. Let us see how far this story travels. And if you want to make sure you never miss what comes next, tap that like button now. These stories don't wait for anyone. Now, let's go back to where this began. The town of Harwick, Colorado, in the autumn of 1883, was not a place that forgave weakness. It forgave very little, actually. Late rent, a bad harvest, a man who drank on Tuesday instead of Saturday. But weakness it could not abide at all, and a young woman alone was, in the eyes of Harwick, the purest form of weakness there was. Evelyn had not started out alone. She'd arrived in Harwick 2 years earlier as Evelyn Marsh, new wife of Nathaniel Hartley, a man who repaired saddles and spoke in full sentences and laughed at things that were actually funny. He wasn't rich. He wasn't particularly ambitious. But he showed up every morning and he meant what he said. And for a girl who'd grown up in a house where neither of those things were reliable, that counted for more than most people would understand. They had 14 months together. Good months, mostly. Daniel's shop did steady enough business. They rented a 2-room house at the edge of town, and Evelyn learned to manage the books and stretch a dollar in ways that would have impressed a banker. She wasn't trained in any formal sense. She just paid attention. That was the skill she'd been practicing her entire life without anyone ever telling her it was a skill. Then Daniel caught a fever in January. By the end of February, he was gone. It happened the way most terrible things happen on the frontier. Not dramatically, not with warning, just a slow undoing that didn't announce itself until it was already finished. One morning he was coughing. 3 weeks later he wasn't breathing. The doctor charged $4 for 2 visits and a bottle of something that hadn't helped. The landlord gave her 30 days. Evelyn spent those 30 days very carefully. She sold what she could. She paid what she owed. She ate less than she should have and slept in short intervals because the nights were when she couldn't stop the part of her mind that kept counting what was gone. She was not someone who cried easily, which sometimes made people think she wasn't someone who felt things deeply. Both things were true. She didn't cry easily, and she felt things very deeply, and they had nothing to do with each other. By the time she walked out of that 2-room house for the last time, she had $11, a canvas bag with 2 changes of clothes, a good knife, and a cast-iron skillet that had been a wedding gift from Daniel's aunt. The skillet weighed more than everything else combined. She kept it anyway. The next 6 weeks were instructive in a way that school never had been. She asked at the general store. They needed a stock boy, not a woman. She asked at the hotel. The manager looked her over in a way that made her take a step back toward the door, and she decided on her own that the position wasn't available. She tried the laundry, 2 different farms at the edge of town, and a widow named Mrs. Greer who supposedly needed household help. Mrs. Greer took one look at Evelyn, 21, brown-haired, not unattractive, and told her she didn't need that kind of help, thank you very much, in a tone that made clear exactly what kind of help she was worried about. Evelyn didn't argue. She thanked the woman and left. That was the pattern. She was either too young, too female, too unmarried, or, in the case of Mrs. Greer, too present in ways she hadn't chosen and couldn't change. She wasn't bitter about it yet. Bitterness takes energy, and she was running low. She was down to $3 and staying in a room above the feed store. The owner, Mr. Pell, was an older man who reminded her of her grandfather and had offered the room at a reduced rate because he said he couldn't sleep if he knew a young woman was spending the winter outdoors. when she overheard two men talking in the street below her window. One of them said Blackwood's outfit was hiring for the fall cattle drive, that Nathaniel Blackwood was taking 3,000 head north and needed an experienced camp cook because his last one had broken his leg in Pueblo. She didn't know who Nathaniel Blackwood was. Not yet. She lay on her cot and looked at the ceiling and thought about what she knew about cooking for large numbers of men, which was more than most people would assume. Her father had worked logging camps when she was a girl, and she'd spent 2 summers helping in the camp kitchen because there was nowhere else for her to be. She knew how to manage a fire in bad weather. She knew how to stretch flour and make it taste like something. She knew that men who work hard and sleep rough will eat almost anything if it's hot and there's enough of it, and they'll respect whoever provides that more than they'll let on. She also knew she had no formal credentials, no letters of reference, no husband, and no experience with cattle drives specifically. She went the next morning anyway. The Blackwood outfit was camped 2 miles outside of Harwick, at a site they used as a staging ground before drives north. Evelyn walked the 2 miles because she couldn't afford to hire a horse, and she arrived with dust on her boots and her hair pulled back tight and her canvas bag over one shoulder. She'd left the skillet with Mr. Pell for safekeeping. She didn't want to carry it in like she was auditioning for a kitchen position at a boarding house. The camp was larger than she'd expected, maybe 30 men. Horses, equipment, supply wagons in various stages of loading. The smell of cattle drifting in from the holding pens to the east. It was early morning and there was a cold edge to the air that hadn't been there a week ago, the kind of cold that reminds you the season is turning whether you're ready or not. She found the foreman, a compact, no-nonsense man named Garrett, near the main supply wagon. He was checking inventory with the kind of focused expression that told her he was busy and didn't want to be interrupted. She interrupted him anyway. "I heard your outfit needs a camp cook," she said. "I'm applying." Garrett looked up from his clipboard. He was maybe 50, with a face that had seen a great deal of weather and had opinions about most of it. He looked at her the way people look at something that doesn't fit the category they're working with. "How old are you?" he said. 21. "You ever cooked for a cattle crew before?" "I've cooked for logging camps. 2 summers. 40 to 60 men each time." He studied her. "That's different." "In some ways," she agreed. "Same principles." Garrett was quiet for a moment, turning his pencil over in his fingers. "Mr. Blackwood makes the final call on crew. He's not here yet. You'd need to wait." "I can wait," she said. So she waited. She found a spot near one of the supply wagons, sat on her bag, and waited. The crew moved around her with varying degrees of awareness. Some ignored her completely. Some looked at her with straightforward curiosity, the kind that doesn't mean anything in particular. And then there were men like Colton Vane. She'd noticed him right away because he was the kind of man who arranged himself to be noticed. Tall, broad in the shoulders, good-looking in a rough-edged way that he was clearly aware of, with a way of moving through a space that suggested he considered himself its natural authority. He was maybe 30, and he had the ease of a man who had never been significantly wrong about himself in front of witnesses. He saw her sitting by the wagon, and he stopped. He looked at her. Then he looked at Garrett. "What's she doing here?" he said. Not asking her. Asking Garrett, as if Evelyn were a piece of equipment that had been left in the wrong place. "Waiting to speak with Mr. Blackwood," Garrett said, without looking up. Colton's eyes came back to Evelyn. He smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that meant he was friendly. You lost a sweetheart?" "No," she said. "Because this is a working cattle camp, not a—" He looked at her bag, at her boots, at her in general. "Whatever it is you're looking for." "I'm looking for a job," she said. "Same as most of the men, I'd imagine." Something shifted in his expression. Not anger exactly, more like recalibration. He hadn't expected that. He looked at Garrett again. Garrett had the small, controlled expression of a man who was pretending very hard to be focused on his clipboard. "Right," Colton said, and walked away. That was when the comments started. Not constant, not vicious. More like water dripping on stone, the kind of thing that's meant to wear a person down by accumulation. Colton said something to the men near him. 2 of them laughed. Someone called over from across the camp with a remark about the cook situation that got another laugh. Evelyn sat on her bag and looked straight ahead and thought about the cast-iron skillet she'd left with Mr. Pell and whether she should have brought it after all. She wasn't embarrassed. She was calculating. Nathaniel Blackwood arrived at camp just before noon. She had heard his name by then, heard it from several different directions, in tones that told her something about how he was regarded. Not the way men talk about someone they're afraid of. The way they talk about someone they trust, which is different, and, on the frontier, rarer. He rode in on a dark bay horse, no particular ceremony about it, just a man returning to his camp from wherever he'd been. He was in his late 30s, she guessed. Taller than average, but not dramatically so. Lean, a face that had more angles than softness, with the look of someone who spent most of his time outside and didn't think about it. Dark hair going gray at the temples. He wore his authority the way good workers wear their tools, comfortably, without putting them on display. He dismounted, handed the horse off to a young wrangler, and spoke briefly with Garrett. She could see him listening more than talking. Then Garrett said something, and Blackwood looked over in her direction. He walked toward her with the unhurried gait of a man who didn't see a reason to rush. He stopped about 6 feet away and looked at her with something that wasn't quite assessment. It was more careful than that. Less about deciding what she was, and more about not deciding too quickly. "Garrett says you're here about the cook position," he said. "Yes, sir." "Where have you worked before?" 2 logging camps, summers of 80 and 81. 40 men, and then 60. I also managed the supply accounting at my husband's saddle shop in Harwick for 14 months, so I understand provisioning and cost management. He was quiet a moment. "Your husband?" "He passed in February." He nodded once, not with excessive sympathy, not the kind of nod that's actually discomfort dressed up, just acknowledgement, the genuine kind. "You know this is a trail drive," he said, "not a kitchen. You'd be cooking over open fire, moving camp every few days, working in weather." "I understand that." "You done that before?" "I've done fire cooking in poor conditions," she said. "I'm a fast learner for the rest." "Every applicant says that." "I know," she said. "I don't have a way to prove it except by doing the work." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "What did you cook in those camps, specifically?" And this she knew. She could feel herself shift slightly, the way you do when someone finally asks you the right question. She told him. She told him about the bread made in covered iron pans in camp conditions, the bean and salt pork recipes that stretched across 60 men, the way she'd learned to time cooking for men who came off shifts at different hours so nothing sat cold too long. She told him about the time a supply delivery was 2 days late and she'd fed 60 loggers for 2 days on reduced rations without triggering a complaint because she'd planned the reduction gradually so no single meal felt like a cut. Blackwood listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet again. "You're hired on a trial basis," he said. "First week tells me whether you stay." Well, it was the right answer, but it hit her in a complicated way. Not because she doubted herself, she didn't particularly, but because trial basis meant she'd said exactly the right things and done exactly the right things, and she still hadn't actually convinced him of anything. She was starting from less than 0, same as always. She had about 10 seconds to process this before Colton Vane, who had apparently been watching the conversation from 15 feet away, spoke up. "Mr. Blackwood." His voice was respectful in tone and pointed in implication. "You sure about that?" Blackwood turned. He didn't seem irritated exactly, but there was a quality to the way he looked at Colton that suggested the question had been noted and evaluated and found to be about 3 inches past the edge of what was Colton's business. "Yes," Blackwood said. And then he turned and walked back toward the supply wagon, and that was the end of that conversation. But it wasn't the end of anything, and they both knew it. Colton looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She held his gaze for 1 measured second, and then she turned and picked up her canvas bag and went to introduce herself to the man who'd been acting as temporary cook, to find out what supplies were on hand and what needed to be done. Because that was the thing about people like Colton Vane. They watched to see if you'd flinch. If you gave them a flinch, you'd never get the ground back. So you didn't flinch. You just went to work. The drive was set to depart in 2 days. Evelyn used those 2 days the way a person uses borrowed time. Completely, without waste. She inventoried the food supplies and found 3 problems immediately. The flour was improperly stored and had moisture in 2 of the sacks. The coffee supply was calculated for 25 men rather than 30, and someone had apparently included 2 cases of canned oysters in the provisions, which was a baffling decision for a cattle trail in October, and which she set aside to be returned before departure. She reported the flour situation to Garrett, who authorized a replacement of the 2 compromised sacks. She recalculated the coffee quantities and submitted the revised order to the provisions account. Both of these things she did without fanfare, just steady and methodical, and the first time Garrett really looked at her, not as a curiosity, but as a person doing a job, was when he saw the written supply revision with the corrected arithmetic. "You can do this in your head?" he said, looking at the figures. "I had practice," she said. He put the paper in his pocket. That was all. But it was something. The men were a more complicated situation. There were 32 of them when you counted the Wranglers and Outriders, and they ranged from openly skeptical to deliberately indifferent to, in a handful of cases, simply not interested in her existence one way or another. The last category was actually her favorite, men too busy with their own work to have opinions about hers. She cooked the first camp dinner on the evening before departure. She made a beef and corn chowder thick enough to stand a spoon in, with a double batch of cornbread in the camp ovens, and a pot of stewed dried apple that she'd found in the back of the provisions and decided to use before it turned. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't supposed to be. It was hot and filling, and there was enough of it, and that was the only question that mattered. She stood back and watched them eat. Not hovering, not seeking approval, just watching, the way she always watched, cataloging information. Who ate fast and who ate slow, who went back for seconds, who grimaced at the apple, which told her their sweet preference was different, who ate everything on their plate with the single-minded focus of a man who didn't get enough food somewhere in his past. Nathaniel Blackwood ate quickly and without visible opinion, which told her nothing. Then he walked past the cook fire on his way to the horse lines, and he paused. "Good supper," he said. Just that. Then he kept walking. Colton, nearby, said nothing. He'd cleaned his plate, though, she'd noticed. The first morning on trail was cold and gray, with a wind coming down from the north that had winter in it, even if the calendar hadn't caught up yet. Evelyn was up before dawn. She'd been up before dawn every day of her adult life. It was simply how she was constructed. And the fire was going and the coffee was ready before any of the crew came off their bedrolls. This was not accidental. She had learned in the logging camps that the first thing a working man reaches for in the morning is coffee. And if that coffee is there and hot and ready, something in him relaxes that stays relaxed for the rest of the day. It was not psychological manipulation. It was more like attending to a real need at the moment it exists. That was the whole of cooking for crews, really, not the recipes. The timing. The second morning, Burl, the thick-necked man who'd slow-clapped when she arrived, poured his own cup and grunted something at her that might have been morning. She didn't make anything of it. Third morning, he said it clearly. By the fourth, he was telling her unprompted that he preferred his coffee a shade stronger, and she'd adjusted it without comment. That was how it worked. Not all at once, piece by piece, person by person, one small accommodation at a time. Colton was the outlier. He accepted the food because he had to eat, and he said nothing because there was nothing to say yet. She wasn't making mistakes, and he needed mistakes to work with. But she could feel his attention, the way you can feel a weather system before it arrives. He was waiting. She didn't know for what. On the fifth day, she found out. They were camped near a creek bed that evening, and the wind had picked up considerably. Evelyn was monitoring a pot of beans on the fire, adjusting the heat by moving rocks, watching the way the fire was behaving in the wind with the particular attention she gave to things that could become problems. Colton walked up with 2 other men, Heck and a younger cowboy named Doss, and sat near the fire without asking, which was fine. The fire wasn't hers. "Beans again," Colton said. "They'll be ready in 20 minutes, she said. "Had beans 4 nights out of 5, he said. She looked at him. "You have a suggestion for what else I should make with the provisions we have?" He smiled. That smile. "I'm just saying a real cook might do something different." "A real cook works with what's on the wagon," she said. "Same as a real cowboy works with the cattle he has, not the cattle he wishes he had." Heck made a sound that was almost a laugh, and then converted it into a cough at a glance from Colton. Doss looked at his boots. Colton's smile didn't waver, but something behind it did. "You got a mouth on you for someone who's still on trial," he said. "I've got opinions about provisioning," she said. "That's a job requirement." She turned back to the beans. She heard him stand, heard the three of them move away. She gave the pot one more stir and then set the ladle down and took a slow breath. Her hands were steady. She was grateful for that. 20 minutes later, Blackwood appeared at the edge of the firelight. She hadn't heard him come up. He moved quietly for a large man. He stood for a moment watching her portion out the beans into the line of waiting tin plates. "I heard you and Colton just now," he said, low enough that only she caught it. She looked up. "How was testing me?" she said. "He was," Blackwood agreed. "I passed?" He thought about it for a second, which was more honesty than she'd expected. "You held your ground without being ugly about it," he said. "Whether that's passing depends on Colton." "It depends on me," she said, "not on him." Blackwood looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up a tin plate and got in line with the rest of his crew. And that was the night Evelyn began to understand that Nathaniel Blackwood was a more complicated person than his reputation had led her to expect. The question that kept returning to her in the quiet hours. And there were quiet hours, even on a cattle drive. The deep watches of early morning when the camp was asleep and the fire was low and the only sounds were wind and cattle. Was not will I survive this, but something more fundamental. It was, what does it mean to prove something to people who have already decided? She had been proving things her whole life. To her father, who had not particularly wanted a daughter. To the schools that thought girls were temporary students on their way to becoming someone's wife. To the town of Harwick, which had looked at her after Daniel died and seen a problem to be managed rather than a person managing. And now to 32 cowboys and one foreman and one cattle king who had hired her on a trial basis and meant it sincerely. The answer she kept coming back to was unsatisfying but true. You don't prove things to people who've decided. You just do the work. And eventually some of them see it, and the ones who don't, that's about them now, not you. She was not all the way to believing this yet. She was 21 and 4 months a widow and tired in ways that went deeper than sleep could fix. But she was working on it. She poured herself the last of the coffee, cold now, and drank it anyway, and watched the fire settle into itself, and tried to rest without quite sleeping, which was the best she'd managed most nights since February. Tomorrow the trail would continue. The cattle would move north. Colton Vane would watch for her to stumble. And Nathaniel Blackwood would watch too, but differently, with the particular attention of a man who had not yet made up his mind, which was, she was beginning to think, more valuable than anyone's certainty. She would be ready. She was always ready. That was the thing about her that nobody had figured out yet. Not Colton, not the crew, not even Blackwood. The thing that all her watching and listening and adjusting and enduring had built into her over 21 years of a life that had not been easy and had not been kind and had not once waited for her to feel ready before it asked something of her. She was not remarkable because of what she had. She never had much. She was remarkable because of what she did with it. The fire crackled once, settling. Somewhere in the dark, a calf called out and was answered. Evelyn Hartley finished her cold coffee and set the cup down beside the dead coals and pulled her coat tighter and stayed very still and waited for morning. Morning came the way it always did on the trail. Not gently, not with any particular consideration for the people who had to meet it. The sky went from black to gray to a pale, washed-out blue in the space of about 40 minutes, and by the time there was enough light to see clearly, Evelyn already had 2 fires going and the first pot of oats thickening over the lower flame. She had slept maybe 3 hours. She didn't dwell on this. Dwelling on it didn't add the hours back. The cattle were restless that morning. She could hear them from camp, that low collective unease that moves through a herd the way rumors move through a town, one animal picking it up from the next, until the whole mass of them is shifted into a different register. The wranglers on night watch had been riding wider circles than usual. She'd heard the horses moving. Whatever was in the air, a predator smell, a weather change, something only cattle could sense, it was communicating itself through 3,000 animals, and that was not a small thing. She made the oats thicker than usual. Men who were going to spend the first hours of the day managing edgy cattle needed something that stayed with them. She added the last of the dried fruit into the pot and let it reconstitute in the heat. It wasn't much, but it was something extra, and something extra on a hard morning was the difference between a crew that kept its temper and one that didn't. Burl was first to the fire, same as most mornings now. He held his plate out without speaking, which was fine with her. He'd stopped the mock clapping around day 3, and had moved into a version of neutral that she was choosing to call progress. He looked at the oats, looked at the dried fruit reconstituted into something resembling actual food, and made a small sound in the back of his throat. "Cattle are sour this morning," he said. "I noticed," she said. "Storm coming, maybe." He looked at the sky, which offered no obvious evidence of this. "Sky looks clear." "It does," she agreed. He looked at her again, not unkindly. Then he moved off to eat, and the rest of the men came through in their usual order, and she watched the camp the way she always watched it, cataloging, adjusting, noting what was different from yesterday. What was different was Nathaniel Blackwood's posture. He came to the fire later than usual, and when he did, he was carrying the tension of a man who had already been solving problems before most people were awake. He took his plate and stood rather than sitting, which meant he was going to move again in minutes. He ate fast. He was looking north. "You think it's a storm?" she asked, because she had been right about the cattle, and she wanted to know if she was right about him. He glanced at her. "What makes you say storm?" "The herd was nervous all night. The air has a pressure to it." He was quiet for a moment. "Possibly," he said. "Possibly something else." He didn't elaborate, which told her it was something he was still calculating. She didn't push. She went back to managing the fire. But she spent the next hour watching the northern sky with the focused attention of someone who knows that being right about a thing in advance is the only way to be useful when it arrives. The trial period ended on the 7th day, though not with any formal announcement. Garrett came to the cook wagon at midday while the crew was resting the cattle at a creek crossing, and he stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the organized supplies with an expression that suggested he was running an inventory in his head and finding it acceptable. "You documented the flour replacement," he said. "I keep a running supply log," she said. "Daily." "Who taught you that?" "Myself," she said. "When you're managing provisions for 60 men and something runs short, you need to be able to show exactly where it went so nobody thinks you made a mistake with the quantities." She paused. "Or took something." He looked at her at that. A 60-year-old foreman who had seen a great deal and been accused of a few things himself. He understood what she meant. "Mr. Blackwood reviewed your log this morning," he said. "He didn't say anything to me about it. Is that good or bad?" "With Mr. Blackwood," Garrett said. "Not saying anything is generally good." He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the wagon gate, smoothed the brim once, and put it back on his head. "You're off trial." She nodded. She didn't say thank you, because this wasn't a gift. It was a recognition of work done, and those were different things, and she was tired of treating them as the same. He walked away. She went back to her supply log and added the midday water usage and the current tally on the salt pork, and she felt something loosen slightly in her chest, some small locked thing that had been held tight since the morning she'd walked into the Blackwood camp with her hat in her hands. She wasn't safe. The frontier didn't do safe, but she had ground under her feet now, and that was enough to work from. Colton Vane did not take her off-trial status well. She didn't know this directly. He didn't confront her, didn't make a scene. What he did was more deliberate than that. He started working the younger men, particularly Doss, who was 19 and eager for Colton's approval in the way that 19-year-olds often are when they're new to something and looking for a model of how to be. She noticed it through the small shifts in Doss's behavior, the way he stopped making eye contact when he came for meals, the exaggerated sighs when a particular dish appeared again, the comment he made, clearly borrowed, not original, about how the coffee was weak that morning, when it was, objectively, the same strength it had been all week. She said nothing to Doss. She said nothing to Colton. But she began paying close attention to the social architecture of the camp in a way she hadn't before. Not defensively, not to find ammunition, but because understanding how a group works is the same skill as understanding how a supply chain works. You need to know where the weak points are before they become failures. What she found was more complicated than she'd expected. Colton had real standing in this crew. Not just the performed authority of a man who was louder than everyone else. Genuine standing, earned standing. He was an exceptional horseman, one of the best she'd seen. He read cattle the way some people read weather. When a situation with the herd turned difficult, the men looked to Colton the way they looked to Garrett, which was saying something, because Garrett had 20 years on him. This was important to understand. A man with real competence in one area often gets extended credit in other areas he hasn't earned. The crew trusted Colton's judgment about cattle, so they extended that trust to his judgment about people. His assessment of Evelyn as unnecessary, as a liability, carried weight it didn't deserve, not because Colton was entirely wrong about everything, but because cattle sense and people sense are not the same thing, and he was applying the first as if it were the second. She couldn't argue this point directly. You couldn't stand up in a camp and say, your friend is competent at his job but wrong about me, because that wasn't how trust worked. You couldn't dismantle a reputation with words. You could only build one with work. So she kept working. The second week on trail was harder than the first. The terrain shifted after they crossed into the higher country, and the cattle were burning more energy on the grades, which meant they needed more water, which meant the watering stops had to be calculated more carefully, which fell partly to her because the supply water for camp was factored against what the cattle were using at each creek crossing. It was logistics, and it wasn't glamorous, but it mattered in the way that unglamorous things almost always matter more than the visible things. She extended the bean rations by adding cracked corn she'd bought at the last supply stop with money from the provisions budget, which she had managed to bring in $3 under the previous week's estimate. She showed Garrett the numbers. He looked at them for a moment. "You've done this before," he said. "Not exactly this," she said, "but close enough." He handed the paper back. "Keep doing it." The meals weren't what she wanted them to be. The limitations of trail cooking were real, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise, even to herself. There was no fresh produce past the first 3 days. The salt pork was beginning to show its age. She compensated with technique where she could, with seasoning she'd brought from her own bag, with the timing of fires and the management of heat. It wasn't enough to make bad ingredients good, but it was enough to make them acceptable. And acceptable was what kept 32 men functional on a hard trail. On the 10th night, Heck, one of Colton's usual companions, the man who had coughed to suppress his laugh during the bean argument, sat down near the fire uninvited and said, without looking directly at her, "My mother used to add molasses to salt pork, made it less like eating saddle leather." She looked at him. He was staring at the fire. "I have some molasses," she said, "in the back of the wagon." He shrugged. "Just saying." She used the molasses the next night. Heck ate 2 plates and didn't say a word about it, which she recognized as the frontier equivalent of enthusiastic endorsement. After that, Heck stopped sitting with Colton when he came for meals. Not dramatically, just a gradual repositioning, the way a compass needle adjusts. He started sitting near Burl, near the fire, near Evelyn's end of camp, one man. But it was something. Nathaniel Blackwood was the hardest person in the camp to read, and she had been trying for nearly 2 weeks. It wasn't that he was cold. He wasn't cold. She'd had cold employers, men who used distance as control, and Blackwood wasn't that. He was more like someone who had learned to hold himself at a particular remove and had held it so long that it had become his natural resting posture, the way a person who has held tension in their shoulders long enough forgets that their shoulders can drop. He managed the drive with the quiet competence of a man who had done this many times and had stopped being impressed by the difficulty of it. He made decisions quickly and without visible anguish, which she respected. He was fair with the crew in a practical way. He paid what he promised. He didn't ask for things he hadn't contracted for. He didn't take credit for other people's work. These were not small qualities on the frontier. They were, in fact, rarer than they should have been. What she couldn't find was the person underneath the ranch owner. There were moments, usually late, usually when the camp was quiet, when she caught him looking at something that wasn't there, with an expression that had nothing to do with cattle or logistics. She recognized that look. She had worn it herself since February. He was carrying something. She didn't know what yet. She found out, in part, on the 12th night. She had stayed up later than usual, resetting the provision wagon after a rough crossing that afternoon had shifted everything inside. It was past 10, the camp long asleep, when she heard footsteps near the far side of the fire and looked up to find Blackwood standing there with a cup of the coffee she'd left warming on the low coals. He looked slightly surprised to find her still up. Not displeased, surprised. "You're always the last one awake," he said. "And the first one up," she said. "That's the job." He sat down on the upturned crate near the fire, which was unusual. He usually stood when he talked to her, which she'd read as readiness to leave, someone who was only passing through the conversation. Sitting was different. She kept sorting inventory and let the silence be what it was. After a while, he said, "You had logging camps. You said 2 summers." "Yes." "How old were you?" She thought back. 13 the first time, 14 the second. He was quiet a moment. "That's young." "My father needed the extra wage," she said. Not bitterly, just factually. It was the truth, and there was no reason to dress it differently. "He sent you to work a logging camp at 13. "He came with me," she said. He wasn't careless about it. He just needed help, and I was what he had." She paused. "I learned a lot. More than school ever taught me." Blackwood turned his cup in his hands. "I have 2 children," he said, and the way he said it, not as information being shared but as something being admitted, told her something. She waited. "Henry is 12, Lillian is 8. He stopped. "Their mother died 3 years ago." There it was, not an explanation exactly, more like the edge of one, the place where the sentence could have continued but didn't. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it in the direct, undramatic way she meant most things. Not as a social formality, but as an acknowledgement of something real. He nodded. The same nod he'd given her when she told him about Daniel, the genuine kind. "Henry is at the age where he's decided he doesn't need much," Blackwood said, "which means he needs everything and won't admit it. Lillian is—" He stopped again. Then, "She doesn't sleep through the night. Not reliably. 3 years, and she still doesn't." Evelyn set down the inventory sheet she'd been working through. 8 is a hard age to lose a parent," she said. "Any age is. But 8? You're old enough to understand the loss, but not old enough to have anywhere to put it." He looked at her then, really looked, in the way he didn't usually. "They're in Montana," he said, "at the ranch, with a housekeeper who's been with us since before. He picked up his coffee, looked at it, set it down. "I do this drive twice a year. I've been doing it since before Clara died, and I've kept doing it because stopping doesn't bring her back, and the ranch doesn't run on grief." He said the last part like a thing he'd told himself so many times it had lost the ability to help. She didn't offer anything reassuring. She had learned in the months since Daniel died that reassurance from a stranger, however well-intentioned, mostly just reminds you how alone you are with the actual grief. So she didn't do that. What she said was, "The drive is 40-some days. 43 if the weather holds." "Then they have 43 days of knowing you're coming home," she said. "Children can hold a lot on that kind of anchor. It's not nothing." He was quiet for a long time after that. Not the uncomfortable quiet of a conversation that had stalled, but something else. The quiet of a man sitting with something he hadn't expected to feel. "No," he said at last. "It's not nothing." He finished his coffee and stood, and said goodnight in a way that was simple and real, and walked back toward the horse line. She watched him go, and then she went back to her inventory, and she stayed at it for another half hour, working through the numbers in the firelight, thinking about a 12-year-old boy who had decided he didn't need much, and an 8-year-old girl who still couldn't sleep through the night. She understood both of them already, and she hadn't met either of them yet. The trouble with Colton came to a head on the 17th day. It started with the water barrel. One of the main camp water barrels, a 60-gallon oak barrel on the supply wagon, had developed a slow leak somewhere around day 15. She'd noticed it first in the weight of the wagon, then confirmed it by checking the fill level against her usage log. The leak was small enough that it wasn't immediately alarming, but on a trail where the next reliable water source was sometimes a full day's ride, a slow leak in the primary water supply was not something you watched and waited on. She'd brought it to Garrett on day 15. He'd said he would have one of the men look at it. On day 16, nobody had looked at it. On the morning of day 17, she checked the barrel again and found it had lost another 4 gallons overnight. She pulled the wagon herself, identified the seam that was failing, and used pitch from the repair kit she'd organized in the supply wagon's lower compartment, which had been in a state of chaotic disorder when she'd arrived, and which she had reorganized in the first 48 hours, to seal the seam from the outside. It wasn't a permanent fix. It was a field repair, enough to hold for a week if it wasn't under too much pressure. She was finishing the repair when Colton came around the side of the wagon. He stopped when he saw what she was doing. His expression went through several things in a short time. "Who told you to do that?" he said. She looked up. Nobody. That's Remy's job. He's the wagon man. Remy looked at it yesterday and said he'd get to it today, she said. We lost another 4 gallons overnight. I got to it first. You could have cracked the barrel worse. She held up the pitch seal, which was clean and even. I didn't. He looked at it. He couldn't argue with the work itself, and that seemed to frustrate him in a specific way. The frustration of a man who had been waiting for a mistake and kept finding competence instead. You're a cook, he said, not a cooper. I'm a person who can read a repair kit and follow instructions, she said. The barrel needed fixing. It's fixed. And if you'd made it worse, we'd be down a water supply 2 days from the next source. If I'd thought I'd make it worse, I wouldn't have done it, she said evenly. I thought about it for an hour before I started. That's how I make decisions. He was close to angry now. She could see it in his jaw, in the set of his shoulders. And underneath the anger, she could see this too if she looked carefully, was something that wasn't quite respect but was in the same direction. He didn't like her, but he was running out of reasons that he could say out loud. You think you can do everything, he said. It was meant as an accusation. It came out as something that sounded almost like bewilderment. No, she said. I think I can do what I'm looking at right now. I don't know what I can't do until I've tried it. He looked at her for one more moment, then he walked away without another word. That afternoon, Garrett examined the barrel repair and told her it was solid work. Remy, the wagon man, who was a decent person and had genuinely meant to fix it himself and had gotten pulled to other things, came to find her that evening and said, without any particular drama, that he kept the pitch in the 3rd box from the left in the lower compartment. I know, she said. That's where I found it. He thought about that. I reorganized that compartment myself about 4 years ago, he said. It shows, she said. It's a good system. He went away looking faintly pleased, which was not the reaction she'd been aiming for, but which she'd take. What changed after the barrel was subtle but real. It wasn't that the crew decided she was exceptional. Most of them hadn't made any conscious decision about her at all. She had simply become part of the machinery of the drive in the way that things become familiar. And familiarity, on the frontier, often counts more than approval. You stop questioning the things that keep working, but a few of them had made a decision, and they made it the way frontier men usually make decisions, quietly, through action rather than declaration. Old Cal, who was nearly 60 and had been driving cattle since before most of the crew was born, started asking her about the supply calculations. Not because he needed to know, he had no stake in the provisions, but because he was the kind of man who was interested in how things worked, and who had recognized somewhere in the 3rd week that Evelyn was a person who knew how things worked. They had a conversation one afternoon while the cattle rested at water that lasted almost 2 hours and covered provisioning mathematics, the cost differential between resupply towns at different points on the trail, the weight calculations for pack mules versus wagons on grade terrain, and the comparative quality of flour from 3 different supply houses he'd used over the years. It was, Evelyn thought, the most genuinely interesting conversation she'd had since Daniel died. Old Cal had 70 years of accumulated knowledge and no pretension about any of it, and talking to him felt like reading a very good book that could also ask questions back. He didn't say she was good at the job. He just kept talking to her like she was. Nathaniel Blackwood noticed this. She saw him watching one afternoon as she and Old Cal argued, genuinely argued, with evidence and counterpoints, about the caloric requirements of men doing heavy work in cold weather versus moderate weather. He didn't say anything, but the quality of his attention was different than it had been in the first week. She was beginning to understand that Blackwood operated on a long timeline. He didn't make quick assessments, and he didn't reverse them easily. This meant his judgments, when they solidified, were worth something. It also meant that winning him over was a matter of sustained demonstration, not single moments. She was fine with that. She had been playing a long game her whole life without knowing what to call it. The storm she had predicted in the first week arrived on the 22nd day. It announced itself the night before, in the way she'd been watching for. The cattle restless again, the horses moving differently, the air carrying a cold that had a different quality than regular October cold. She'd been checking the sky at every opportunity for 3 days, and that evening she made a decision. She went to Garrett. "There's a storm coming," she said. "Significant. Tomorrow, I think, or the day after." Garrett looked at the sky. It was clear, stars visible, no immediate evidence. "What makes you think so?" he said. She told him. The animal behavior, the air pressure, a specific kind of stillness she'd learned to read in logging country when a big weather system was suppressing the usual sounds. She was not entirely certain. She said so. "I might be wrong," she said. "I've been watching it for 3 days and it feels right to me, but I'm working from patterns, not instruments." Garrett was quiet. "What do you need?" "Permission to pull additional firewood now, while we have it, and to store extra provisions in the waterproofed cases tonight instead of tomorrow morning." He thought about it for maybe 10 seconds. "Do it," he said. She did it. She worked late into the night, moving supplies, repacking the waterproof cases, pulling and covering extra wood with the oilcloth she'd located in the wagon's emergency supplies. She recruited 2 of the younger hands who were still up, men who asked no questions once she said Garrett had authorized it, and they worked alongside her without complaint. Nobody else knew she'd done this. It wasn't something she announced. The storm hit the following afternoon. It came in fast from the northwest, the kind of speed that tells you the system has been building for a long time, somewhere far away, and is finally spending itself on whatever is in its path. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 2 hours. The wind came up horizontal and cold, carrying first rain and then something between rain and sleet. The cattle bunched and bawled. The men pulled their coats tight and rode harder than they'd ridden all week, working to keep the herd together against a wind that wanted to scatter everything. Camp was a different story. Because the wood was already covered, the fire was sustainable in conditions where it would otherwise have been dead in 10 minutes. Because the provisions were in the waterproof cases, nothing was lost to the rain. Because she had done this the night before, calmly and without urgency, she was able to spend the storm itself at the fire, keeping it going, keeping the food coming, keeping the coffee hot. When the crew rode in from the herd in shifts, soaked and cold and operating on the particular kind of miserable that sets into a person after 4 hours in cold rain, there was hot food and hot coffee and a sustainable fire. It was not dramatic. She didn't say anything about having prepared for it. She just handed each man a plate and refilled the coffee when it ran low. Burl stood at the fire for a long moment after eating, warming his hands, not looking at anything in particular. "Wood should have been out," he said, to no one specifically. "We'd have been eating cold." "I pulled it last night," she said. He looked at her. "You knew?" "I thought so," she said. "I wasn't sure." He turned back to the fire. After a moment, he said, with the particular gruffness of a man who is expressing something his vocabulary doesn't have a clean word for, "Good thinking." That was all. But from Burl, that was quite a lot. Colton came in with the last group, near dusk. He was soaked through, his hat dripping, his jaw set in the tight expression of a man who had spent hours doing hard physical work in punishment conditions. He came to the fire and took the plate she handed him and stood there eating without speaking. Then he looked at the fire, looked at the covered wood, looked at her. He didn't say anything. He ate his food and walked away. But the look said something that he hadn't been able to say out loud yet, and she filed it away, not as victory, but as information. Nathaniel Blackwood was the last one she served that night. He came to the fire after the rest had eaten, after the worst of the storm had settled into a steady, heavy rain that showed no sign of stopping, but had at least stopped punishing. He was as wet as anyone. His hat was dark with water. He looked tired in the specific way of a man who has been making decisions under pressure for 6 hours. She handed him a plate. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at her. "You prepared for this," he said. "Last night," she said. "I wasn't certain. I thought it was worth the effort either way." He ate. She watched the fire. The rain came down steady on the oilcloth above the woodpile. "I'm starting to think," he said between bites, "that you see things before they happen." "Not before," she said. "Just earlier than most people look." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How early are we talking, generally?" She thought about it honestly. "Long enough to do something about it," she said. "Usually." He looked at her again with that careful expression she'd been trying to read for 22 days, and she still couldn't name it precisely. It wasn't admiration. It was deeper than that, more complicated. It was the look of a man who was revising something he hadn't known he was holding. He finished eating. He handed back the tin plate. And before he walked away, he said quietly, in a way that she thought was not entirely about the storm preparation at all, "Good work, Mrs. Hartley." She nodded. She turned back to the fire. The rain came down. The cattle settled. The camp held together in the dark, around a fire that should not have been possible in those conditions, and was, because she had thought about it the night before, when the sky was still clear and nobody else was looking yet. That was the thing she couldn't explain to Colton, couldn't explain to most people, the thing that wasn't genius or luck, but was something quieter and more durable than either. The simple, unglamorous discipline of paying attention before you need to, of doing the work before it's urgent, of taking the long view in a life that kept handing her nothing but immediate problems. The storm blew through by midnight. The stars came back cold and brilliant, and the cattle were quiet, and the camp slept. Evelyn stayed at the fire another hour. Her coat was damp at the shoulders. Her hands were rough from the woodwork the night before. She was tired in a way that sat in her bones. But the fire was steady, and the camp was fed, and tomorrow the drive would continue north. That was enough. The days after the storm had a different quality to them. Not easier, exactly. The terrain north of the creek crossing was harder going than anything they'd covered yet, the grade steeper and the footing less reliable, and the cattle were still unsettled from 2 days of bad weather. But something in the atmosphere of the camp had shifted, in the particular way that shared difficulty shifts things between people who have come through it together. The men were quieter, less performative. When you've been cold and miserable in the same rain, certain kinds of posturing become difficult to sustain. Evelyn noticed this and was careful not to make anything of it. She had learned in the logging camps and in the 14 months of managing Daniel's shop and in the 4 months of surviving after that the worst thing you can do when people are starting to come around is to acknowledge it directly. Acknowledgement makes people self-conscious about a change they haven't fully chosen yet, and self-consciousness makes them reverse course out of stubbornness. So she said nothing and changed nothing and simply continued doing what she'd been doing and let the shift settle into the camp at whatever pace it needed. What did change, practically, was the information she was getting. Before the storm, the men told her only what they needed to, how many plates, whether there was coffee left, where the next water stop was. After, they told her more. Burl mentioned, offhandedly, that Doss's horse had thrown a shoe on the eastern approach, and that Doss was going to be riding rough until the next town resupply. She noted this because a man riding rough is a tired man, and a tired man eats differently, and she adjusted the portions accordingly without making it obvious. Old Cal told her that one of the outriders had been nursing a bad hand since before the storm and was losing grip strength in the cold. She started making sure the outrider's coffee was hotter than everyone else's because hot hands work better than cold ones, and she kept a jar of rendered fat in the supply wagon that she'd been using for the cast iron, and which also, as it happened, was about the best thing there was for cracked and painful skin in cold conditions. She left it on the wagon's tailgate one morning where the outrider in question could find it without having to ask. He didn't say anything. The next morning, the jar was back in the same spot, noticeably lighter. These were small things. They didn't make headlines. Nobody stood up at dinner and said that the cook had been quietly solving problems they didn't even know she'd noticed. But the camp functioned better in the 4th week than it had in the 1st. And part of that was Evelyn, and part of it was the storm. And she thought those two things were probably connected in ways that would take time to fully understand. Colton Vane, in the days following the storm, was a man operating under internal pressure he hadn't found a way to release. She watched him the way she watched everything, steadily, without staring, fitting observations into a larger picture. He was doing his job, doing it well, managing the herd with the instinctive fluency that she had genuinely come to appreciate, even while she was careful not to let that appreciation show. But there was something working in him that hadn't been there before the storm, a friction she recognized because she'd felt it herself at different times, the friction of a fixed idea meeting incompatible evidence and refusing to update. He had decided she was a liability. He had held that decision through 3 weeks of evidence that contradicted it. And the holding was costing him something, because Colton Vane was, underneath the performance, not a stupid man. He was a man who had organized his world around a certain set of ideas about who belonged where, and those ideas were under sustained pressure from a 21-year-old widow who kept fixing barrels and predicting storms and making coffee that improved as she learned each man's preference. He didn't come at her directly again. Instead, he came at her sideways, through the crew's youngest members. Doss mostly, sometimes a boy named Ferris, who was 17 and on his first drive, and who would have followed Colton off a cliff if Colton had walked that direction with sufficient confidence. She overheard Colton, one night about a week after the storm, telling Doss that the cook's supply predictions were lucky guessing, and that the storm preparation had been Garrett's idea and she'd just executed it. Doss said, "But Garrett said she was the one who told him." Colton said, "Garrett's being polite." She was on the other side of the supply wagon when this happened, near enough to hear clearly and far enough that neither of them knew. She stayed where she was. She finished counting the remaining cornmeal and entered the figure in her log. And when she came around the wagon with the lantern, both men looked briefly startled, and she said good evening to both of them equally and went to bank the fire for the night. She didn't confront Colton. She didn't go to Garrett. She didn't say a word about it to anyone, but she was done waiting for him to come around on his own, because some people didn't come around on their own. They needed an event, a moment that moved things past the point where their fixed idea could hold. She couldn't manufacture that moment, but she could be ready when it arrived. It arrived on the 31st day of the drive, though not in any form she could have predicted. They were 3 days north of a small supply town called Ridgeback, pushing hard because Blackwood wanted to make the Montana border before the weather turned again. The terrain had opened up into a long, shallow valley that was easier on the cattle than the grades had been, and the mood of the drive had lifted accordingly. At the evening, there was something almost relaxed about the men. Not careless, just temporarily relieved of the particular grinding pressure of the past week. Evelyn made extra cornbread that night, using the last of a butter ration she'd been rationing carefully. And the result was better than what she'd managed in weeks. Heck ate 3 pieces and said so out loud, which by this point was not unusual. Old Cal told her it reminded him of something his sister used to make, and the way he said it, with that sideways, slightly surprised pleasure of a thing unexpectedly remembered, was the kind of response that made the constraints of trail cooking feel momentarily worth the effort. Even Colton ate 2 pieces. She noted this and said nothing. Blackwood lingered after dinner, which he'd been doing more frequently over the past week. Not in a way that announced itself. He didn't sit down and initiate conversation, but he found reasons to be near the cook fire later than he needed to be, checking the supply wagon inventory, reviewing maps in the firelight, tasks that could have been done anywhere but happened to be done here. She understood this and was careful not to name it, to him or to herself. They had reached a point in the drive and in whatever was building between them where naming it prematurely would be the thing most likely to break it. So she let it be what it was, 2 people who respected each other's company, finding reasons to extend evenings that would otherwise end. That night he sat on the crate near the fire without pretext and told her more about Henry. "He's been writing me letters," Blackwood said. "On the drive. We cache them at the supply towns and Garrett picks them up." "What does he write about?" "The ranch, mostly. What the horses are doing. Whether the fence on the east pasture held." He paused. "He writes like a foreman's report." She heard what he meant. That there was almost nothing personal in it. That a 12-year-old boy writing his absent father was writing about fences and horses because fences and horses were safer than the things he actually meant. "Does he know you read between the lines?" she asked. "I don't know what he knows," Blackwood said. There was something raw in that, briefly surfaced and then covered again. "He doesn't make it easy to know." "He's protecting himself," she said. "Kids who've lost someone learn to protect themselves in whatever way they can figure out. He's figured out practicality." Blackwood was quiet. His mother was... Clara was very warm, very open with them. "I'm not..." He stopped. "I'm built differently." "That's not a failure," she said. "I didn't say it was." "You implied it," she said. Not unkindly, just precisely, which was how she usually said things. He looked at her with a slightly startled expression, the expression of a man who is not accustomed to being corrected by people who weren't Garrett. "I suppose I did," he said. The fire settled. Somewhere in the herd, cattle moved in the dark. "Henry needs to know his father is paying attention," she said. "Not performing warmth, just paying attention, the specific kind, the kind where you notice what he actually did rather than asking how he's doing in general." He was still looking at her. "Lillian is different," she said. "Lillian needs someone to stay." She didn't know why she said that last part with such certainty. She hadn't met Lillian. She was working from what he'd told her, and from things she understood about what it meant to be 8 years old and unable to sleep through the night 3 years after a loss. But she said it with the confidence of someone speaking from a place that wasn't analysis but something older. Blackwood was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You're very direct." "I know," she said. "Some people find it useful." "I do," he said. "I find it—" He paused, finding the word. "Unusual. In a good way." She looked at him. The firelight did things to his face that made it easier to see the person underneath the cattle king. The tired man, the one who had been managing things alone for 3 years and was carrying it all in his shoulders. "You should sleep," she said. "You look like you haven't properly in a week." He almost smiled. "You manage the crew's sleep now too?" "I manage whatever needs managing," she said. "Sleep is a resource. You're going to need your judgment in 3 days when we hit the border crossing." He did almost smile that time. He stood and said goodnight and walked toward the horse line. She watched him go and turned back to the fire. It was a long time before she slept that night. Not because of worry, more because there was too much present to settle easily. The drive was more than 2/3 done. The camp had found something like equilibrium. Blackwood was sitting by her fire in the evenings talking about his children with the careful, halting honesty of a man who hadn't had anyone to say those things to in a long time. She was aware of what this meant. She was also aware that being aware of it was all she could responsibly afford right now. There was still a third of a cattle drive to complete, and she was still technically an employee, and she had learned, in a life that had not been generous with second chances, to be careful with things she couldn't afford to lose. The fire came on the 34th day. She smelled it before she saw it. That particular combination of smoke and something more acrid, not wood smoke, something drier. She was at the midday camp, the crew out with the herd, Garrett nearby reviewing the schedule for the final push. She was rationing the last of the coffee beans for the home stretch when the smell hit her. She looked south. The smoke was already a column, pale at the base and darkening as it rose. Too much smoke for a campfire. The wind was out of the south, which explained why the smell had arrived before the visible evidence, and the grass in the valley they'd been crossing was dry. It had been dry for days, the storm's moisture long since absorbed, which explained why the column was widening even as she watched. She didn't hesitate. "Garrett," she said, and her voice was level and loud enough to reach him. "Prairie fire, south, winds pushing it north." He turned, looked, and was moving in 3 seconds. He shouted for the outriders. The distant call went up from the herd direction. Someone else had spotted it. And then the camp was in motion. The response to a prairie fire on a cattle drive is a specific chain of actions, and she had never been in one, but she had listened to old Cal describe them over the course of 3 weeks, and she had filed the information away the way she filed everything away. The priority was the herd, getting them moving perpendicular to the fire's path, not ahead of it, because cattle running ahead of fire would run themselves into exhaustion and then die anyway. The second priority was the supply wagon. The third was everything else. She had the supply wagon moving within 4 minutes, herself on the bench, driving, because the 2 wagon hands were already with the herd. She drove it northeast, angling away from the fire's projected path, which she was calculating from the smoke's movement and the wind direction. She was not calm. She wanted to be precise about that in her own mind, even in the middle of it. She was not calm. She was frightened in the particular focused way that fear becomes when there is no alternative to function. Her hands on the reins were tight. Her heart was loud. She was frightened and she kept moving anyway, which was all that mattered. She got the wagon to higher ground, a shelf of rocky terrain that the fire wouldn't take because there was nothing on it to burn. She tied the horses to a large rock formation, checked that they were secure, and turned back to look at the valley. What she saw stopped her breath for a moment. The fire had moved faster than she'd estimated. It was a wall of it now, orange and white at the base where it was hottest, black smoke pouring upward. The sound of it reached her even at this distance, not a roar, more like a continuous tearing. And ahead of the fire, moving north in a mass so dense it was almost like water, were the cattle. 3,000 animals in full stampede. She could see the riders at the edges of the herd, small figures on horses, trying to work the angles, trying to turn the leaders. This was the technique. You turned the leaders turned the herd curved back on itself, and the run lost its direction and momentum. She knew this from old Cal. She knew it intellectually, the way you know the theory of something before you've been in it. She also knew, from where she was standing on higher ground with a clear view of the whole valley, that Nathaniel Blackwood's horse had gone down. She could see it clearly, the dark bay horse stumbling in the far right edge of the valley, going down on its front legs, and Blackwood thrown forward and to the side. He was up in seconds. She could see him moving, so he wasn't badly hurt, but he was on foot, and the leading edge of the herd was maybe 400 yards from him and closing. 400 yards at stampede speed was approximately 30 seconds. She was looking at the supply wagon behind her, not because she had a plan, but because her mind was doing what it did under pressure. Inventorying, assessing, looking for what was there. The bullwhip she had found in the bottom of the wagon 3 weeks ago during her reorganization, labeled in Remy's handwriting as a spare, sat coiled on the lower shelf. She had handled it twice, experimentally, in quiet moments when nobody was watching. She had no real skill with it. She had enough understanding of the principle. She grabbed it and ran. The ground from the rock shelf to the valley floor was rough, and she ran it badly. She tripped twice, caught herself both times, kept going. By the time she hit the valley floor, she had maybe 20 seconds, and she was still 150 yards from Blackwood, who was on his feet but looking in the wrong direction, trying to find a way clear. She didn't have the wind for shouting and running simultaneously. She ran. She hit the front edge of the herd's path, maybe 50 yards from Blackwood, and she planted her feet and she swung the whip. She had no idea if this would work. That was the truth of it. She had a functional understanding of the principle. She had watched Colton use one on a smaller scale to redirect individual animals, and she had seen enough cattle to understand that the front animals in a stampede are responding to pressure from behind far more than to anything in front of them, and that a sudden loud disruption to the side and front could create a deflection if it was sharp enough. She swung the whip 3 times in fast succession. The crack was louder than she'd expected. The first 2 animals in the closest line shied left, sharply, immediately, the way startled animals react. The animal behind them followed. The deflection moved back through the nearest group like a wave, and the wave hit the animals to either side, and for 5 seconds that felt like 5 minutes, the leading edge of the herd was bending. It wasn't enough on its own. She knew that. But it was enough, combined with the riders working the other side, to create a curve in the run, the leaders turning, the followers following, the whole mass of them beginning the great, ugly, grinding arc that slows a stampede. She kept cracking the whip. Her arm was burning. She was out of breath entirely. She cracked it again. Blackwood grabbed her arm from behind. He had crossed the distance between them in the time she'd been focused on the herd, and he had the grip of a man whose adrenaline was speaking louder than anything else, and he pulled her backward and sideways as the nearest animals thundered past, close enough that she could feel the displaced air. They stumbled together into a shallow depression in the ground, not cover exactly, more of a low point, and he put himself between her and the passing herd, and they stayed there, heads down, while 3,000 cattle rearranged themselves around them. The noise was extraordinary. She had no other word for it. It was beyond sound and into something physical, a pressure that moved through the chest. It went on for what felt like a very long time. Then it began to subside. The thunder of hooves became a rumble, became a receding sound. The dust was enormous. She couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction, couldn't see the herd or the riders or the fire or anything at all. Blackwood's hand was on the back of her head. She didn't think he knew it was there. When the dust settled enough to breathe, he moved back and looked at her. His face was covered in dust. There was blood on his left forearm from when he'd been thrown from the horse. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the careful, measured attention of the cattle drive, but something stripped of its management, something immediate and raw. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. "Are you?" He looked at his arm as if he'd forgotten it. "Horse came down on the grade. I'm fine." They stood. Around them the valley was settling, dust drifting, cattle sound receding to the north where the riders were working to slow and turn the herd's remnants. The fire's smoke still heavy in the southern sky, but the fire itself clearly losing ground as it ran out of fuel in the lower valley. Colton rode up at a hard gallop and pulled up 15 feet away, the horse blowing. He looked at Blackwood. Then he looked at Evelyn. Then at the bullwhip in her hand. He had been working the left side of the herd when the deflection happened. He had seen it. She knew from his face that he had seen exactly what she had done and what it had resulted in. He was a man who understood cattle, and he had just watched a woman who had never handled a whip in a stampede do something that had measurably bent the direction of the herd at the critical moment. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said to Blackwood slowly, "You okay?" "Yes," Blackwood said. Colton looked at Evelyn again. Something was working in his face. Not the calculation she was used to seeing there. Something different. Something more like a man taking an honest inventory and finding it came out differently than he'd expected. He didn't say she'd done well. He didn't apologize. He looked at her for 3 more seconds. He looked at her for 3 more seconds with that particular expression, and then he turned his horse and rode back toward the herd. Old Cal reached them on foot 10 minutes later, having come down from the eastern ridge where he'd been working the angle. He was 60 years old and breathing hard, and he looked at Evelyn with the expression of a man confirming something. "That was you on the whip," he said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly, several times. He looked at the whip. He looked at the area where the deflection had occurred. He did the math in his head, the way a man who has driven cattle for 40 years does math about a stampede, angles and distances and timing. "Good deflection," he said. "Not clean, but good." Coming from Old Cal, that was the equivalent of a standing ovation. The herd was fully settled by evening. The fire had burned itself out in the lower valley, taking a stretch of grazing land with it, but failing to reach the terrain where the cattle had been pushed. The damage was real. 2 animals lost to the run, 1 horse with a strained leg from the early chaos. But what the damage could have been, against what it was the kind of thing that made experienced men quiet with something that was close to relief and close to something else. The crew ate in that quiet that night. Evelyn had made a full meal, everything she had, all the good things left in the supplies, because after a day like this one, food was not fuel, it was something more human than that. Nobody said much. The fire was high. The cattle were down. The horses were tended. Garrett sat near the fire longer than usual, and at a certain point he looked at Evelyn across the flames with an expression that she understood and that he didn't need to speak aloud. But Blackwood spoke it. He stood up from where he'd been sitting, the crate near the fire, her spot and his now, by this point in the drive, and he looked around at the crew, all of them, including Colton, who was on the far edge of the firelight. "Today," Blackwood said, and his voice was level but carried the particular weight of a man who chose his words precisely. "We could have lost the herd. We could have lost men." He paused. "We didn't." Another pause. "The fire preparation, the storm preparation, the supply management for the past 34 days. And today." He stopped. Then he said it plainly, because Nathaniel Blackwood, when he said something, meant it to be clearly understood. "Mrs. Hartley." He looked at her. The fire crackled. 32 men were quiet. "This drive is intact because of her work," he said. "All of you know that, or you should." He sat back down. Evelyn looked at the fire. Her jaw was tight, and she made herself relax it, made herself breathe. She was not going to be undone by recognition when she had held herself together through everything else. Burl, on the other side of the fire, made a low sound that the men around him echoed. Not applause. Something more like assent. The sound of a group of people arriving collectively at a truth they had reached individually over different timelines. Doss, 17 and earnest, started to say something, then stopped, then said, "I'm sorry I gave you trouble early on," to his plate more than to her. She looked at him. He was red in the face and determined. "You didn't know yet," she said. "Now you do." He nodded very hard at his plate. From the edge of the firelight, Colton said nothing, but he was sitting with his elbows on his knees, looking at the ground between his boots, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who was having a genuine reckoning with himself and finding it uncomfortable, which was the only kind of reckoning that meant anything. She didn't look at him too long. She looked at the fire instead. Later, after most of the crew had dispersed to their bedrolls, Blackwood came to stand beside the fire where she was cleaning up. He stood close enough that she was aware of it, not uncomfortably, but absolutely. He had changed his shirt. She could see the edge of a bandage on his left arm where Garrett had cleaned and wrapped it. "You could have been killed," he said. Quiet. Not accusatory, just the plain truth of it, laid down between them. "So could you," she said. I was already in the path, he said. You ran into it. She thought about how to answer that honestly. I didn't think about it in those terms, she said. I thought about what was in front of me and what I had in my hand. That's not an explanation, he said. No, she agreed. I don't have a better one. He was looking at her the way he had in the depression during the stampede, with that stripped-back expression, and this time there was nowhere for either of them to put it except directly between them where it was. I've been building something for 15 years, he said. The ranch, the empire, as people call it. It's real, and it matters. He paused. I thought it was the most important thing I had. She waited. I'm revising that, he said. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with complete directness, the directness of a man who had spent a long time being careful and had decided for this one moment to stop. She held his gaze. Nathaniel, she said, his first name, the first time, we have 9 days left on this drive. I know that, he said. I'm still your cook for 9 days. I know that too, he said. And after 9 days? He was quiet for a moment. The fire settled between them. After 9 days, he said, I'd like to have a different conversation. She looked at him for a long moment. The firelight moved on his face. She thought about the 9 days and the ranch in Montana and a 12-year-old boy writing his father letters about fences and an 8-year-old girl who still couldn't sleep through the night. She thought about the woman she'd been 4 months ago, sitting on a cot above a feed store with $3 and a cast-iron skillet and no direction. All right, she said, just that. But they both understood it to be, in its quiet way, the most significant thing either of them had said on the entire drive. She turned back to the fire. He stood there a moment longer, and then he walked away. And the camp was quiet around her, and the smoke from the afternoon's fire still drifted on the southern horizon, pale against the dark sky. And she stood in the warmth of the cook fire and breathed in and breathed out, and let herself, for the first time in a long time, think about what came next. The 9 days that followed were the strangest of the entire drive. Not harder. The terrain eased considerably once they crossed into the lower Montana grasslands, the grades flattening into long, open country that the cattle took to without complaint. Not easier either, in the way that matters. The work was the same: the fires, the meals, the supply logs, the early mornings and late nights. Evelyn did all of it the same as she had done it from the beginning, with the same attention and the same lack of ceremony about her own effort. But something had changed in the negative space around the work. The thing that Blackwood had said at the fire on the 34th night, after 9 days I'd like to have a different conversation, sat in the camp the way a low-pressure system sits before weather. You couldn't see it directly. You felt it in everything around it. The crew felt it too, though they wouldn't have named it that way. What they felt was a shift in how Blackwood moved around the cook fire in the evenings. A shift in how Evelyn and Blackwood spoke to each other about practical matters that now carried a second layer underneath the practical. Men who work close together on long drives develop a sensitivity to these things. Not gossip, exactly. More like the animal awareness of changes in the group's social weather. Burl said nothing. Old Cal said less than nothing, which for him meant he had noticed everything and decided to let it be. Hex started finding reasons to take his after-dinner coffee on the far side of camp, which was his version of giving people room. Daw, who was 17 and did not yet understand that sometimes the kindest thing is to look somewhere else, asked Ferris one evening whether he thought Mr. Blackwood was sweet on the cook. Ferris, who was also 17 but had a slightly more developed instinct for self-preservation, told Doss to keep his mouth shut and eat his beans. Colton Vane did not speak to Evelyn directly in the days following the fire. This was not avoidance in the hostile sense. It was more like a man who had been arguing a position for 34 days and had run out of argument and who needed time to locate himself in the new territory. She understood this because she had watched it happen before. Her father had been a man who changed his mind rarely and always privately, who would hold a wrong position through evidence and confrontation and only quietly stop holding it weeks later when he thought nobody was paying attention. Colton was similar. He stopped the sideways comments to Doss. He stopped the pointed looks when she made decisions about provisions. On the 38th day, when the supply wagon got a wheel caught in a shallow creek crossing and she and Remy were working to free it, Colton dismounted without being asked and put his shoulder to the wagon wheel alongside them. He didn't look at her. He didn't say anything. He just pushed. The wagon came free. He got back on his horse and rode back to the herd. She looked at Remy. Remy looked at her. Neither of them said anything, which was the correct response. The following morning, Colton came for his coffee before most of the others were up. This was unusual. He was normally a middle-of-the-pack riser, not early, never last. He stood at the fire with his cup, and she was reorganizing the morning's provisions, and they were the only two people at camp. He said, "I owe you an apology." She looked up at him. He was looking at the fire, not at her. His jaw was set in the way of a man for whom apologies were not a comfortable exercise, but who was doing it anyway because he'd concluded it was necessary. "I made it harder for you than it needed to be," he said. "From the first day. I decided what you were before I knew anything, and I worked to keep you from proving me wrong." He paused. That wasn't right. She studied him for a moment. He still wasn't looking at her, which she understood. It was easier to say honest things to a fire. "Why?" she said. "Not what you did, but why?" She wanted to understand it, not just receive the apology. He was quiet for a long moment. "My mother tried to come on a drive," he said, "when I was young. My father's outfit. She was a good woman, capable. But she didn't. It went badly. She got hurt. He sent her home." He looked at his cup. "I decided early that there were places for women and places that weren't. I held it too long." She thought about this. It was more honesty than she'd expected from him, and she was careful with it accordingly. "She got hurt because the work was dangerous or because nobody helped her," she said. He looked at her then. First time since he'd started talking. "I was 8, he said. "I didn't think to ask that." "Might be worth thinking about now," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his face was different, not softened exactly, but restructured, like a thing that has been held in one configuration a very long time and has finally been set down and picked back up a different way. "Might be," he said. He finished his coffee and poured himself a second cup, which he never did, and stood there drinking it in silence while the camp slowly woke around them. She went back to the provisions. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had said what needed saying and didn't need to add to it. They reached the Montana border on the 40th day. There was no ceremony to it, a change in the quality of the grassland, a survey marker Garrett pointed out, and Blackwood saying briefly that they were across. The men acknowledged it the way they acknowledged most milestones on the trail, which was without much outward display but with a visible internal adjustment, a slight easing of the shoulders, a fraction more willingness to talk. Evelyn noted the milestone and went back to calculating how many more days the remaining provisions needed to stretch. 3 days to the Blackwood Ranch, weather cooperating. She had enough for 4 days at current quantities, enough for 5 if she pulled back on the secondary meals. She would not pull back. The men were working hard and eating what they needed, but it was useful to know the margin. That evening, Blackwood sat by the fire and told her about the ranch in a way he hadn't before. Not the logistics of it, the acreage, the cattle numbers, the operational structure, but the physical reality of it, the way it looked in different seasons, the particular quality of the light in the morning over the eastern pastures. He talked about it the way a person talks about something they've been away from long enough to be able to see it clearly again. "Clara chose the site for the house," he said. "I wanted to build higher up, better view, more defensible from weather. She wanted it in the lower meadow." He paused. She was right. The meadow gets sun earlier and keeps it later, and in a Montana winter that matters more than the view. "Is it a good house?" Evelyn asked. He thought about it genuinely, which she appreciated, not reaching for the reassuring answer. "It's a solid house," he said. "It's not a warm house yet. It was warm when Clara was in it." He looked at the fire. "The housekeeper, Mrs. Aldrich. She's capable, and she's kind, and she's been with us since Henry was a baby. But she's 62, and she can't be everything." Evelyn said nothing. She let the statement be what it was. "Henry has started cooking his own breakfast," Blackwood said, and something in the way he said it told her this was a thing that broke his heart a little. Not because it was bad, but because of what it meant. A 12-year-old figuring out how to need less. "He gets up before Mrs. Aldrich. He says he doesn't want to wake her." "That's kind," she said. "And it's also him not wanting to need anything from anybody." "That's what I thought," Blackwood said. They were quiet for a while. "What does Lillian do in the mornings?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "She waits," he said. She wakes up early, Mrs. Aldrich says, and she just waits. In her room. Until someone comes. Evelyn kept her face steady. In her room. Until someone comes. She knew exactly what that was. She had done a version of it herself, in the months after Daniel, waking in the early hours and waiting for the world to reassemble itself into something navigable. The difference was that she had been 21. Lillian was 8. I'll meet them at the end of the drive, she said. Not a declaration, just a statement of fact, and she meant it simply. She would meet them. She would form her own understanding. She would not project onto 2 children she'd never seen. Yes, Blackwood said, as simply as she'd said it. That was the whole of the conversation, but it was enough. The last 3 days of the drive were clear and cold and straightforward, the way endings sometimes are when the drama has already spent itself. The cattle moved well on the Montana grass. The men worked with the automatic competence of a crew that had found its rhythm and was running on it. Evelyn managed the remaining provisions with the precision she'd maintained throughout, and on the final evening she produced a meal that used the last of everything she'd been rationing since Ridgeback. A beef stew thick with the dried vegetables she'd been adding to in every supply town, served with the last of the good flour as drop biscuits, and strong coffee from the beans she'd been holding back for exactly this occasion. Old Cal ate his portion, then sat looking at his empty bowl. "Young woman," he said, which was the first time he had addressed her as anything other than you or Mrs. Hartley. "I've been on 41 cattle drives in my life. I've eaten out of a lot of camp kitchens." He set his bowl down. "You're in the top 3. Burl, overhearing, said, "Who are the other 2? "None of your business," Old Cal said, and poured himself more coffee. This passed for a celebration, in the way of the frontier, and Evelyn received it accordingly. Colton, eating nearby, said quietly, to himself more than to anyone, "Top 2, more likely." He said it without looking up from his plate, and the men around him heard it, and there was a brief collective pause, and then things continued, but the pause had meant something. Even Colton, in the particular way of Colton, had said what he'd arrived at. She heard it. She said nothing, but she noted it and filed it away in the same place she filed all the things that mattered. They drove the last of the cattle into the Blackwood Ranch pens on a Tuesday afternoon in November, under a sky that was the particular pale blue of high country autumn, cold and clear, and very wide. The ranch was larger than she'd imagined from Blackwood's descriptions, not in the sense of the land, which she'd understood to be extensive, but in the sense of the presence of it. The main house sat in the lower meadow, as he'd said, a long 2-story structure of timber and stone with a covered porch running the full length of the front. The outbuildings ranged beyond it: barn, bunkhouse, equipment sheds, a smokehouse, what looked like a small office building near the main gate. It was a serious operation, not the frontier romanticism that people in cities imagined when they thought about Western ranches. It was a working place, scarred by work, practical in all its choices. She saw the children before she heard them. They came out of the main house as the cattle were going into the pens. 2 figures on the porch, the smaller one moving forward to the porch rail, and the taller one hanging back near the door. Mrs. Aldrich appeared behind them, wiping her hands on her apron, and said something to the smaller one that didn't carry across the distance. The smaller one, Lillian, 8 years old, dark-haired like her father, came off the porch at a run when Blackwood dismounted. She crossed the yard with the total commitment of a small child running towards someone who has been gone too long, and Blackwood crouched down to meet her and caught her in both arms and straightened up with her, and she put her face against his neck. He held her for a long time. His eyes were closed. Henry came off the porch more slowly. I was tall for 12, already wearing something of his father's posture, the contained, upright carriage of a person who was watching himself. He walked across the yard with his hands in his pockets and stopped a few feet from his father and said, "You're 2 days early." "Weather held," Blackwood said over Lillian's head. Henry looked at the cattle going into the pens. He looked at the crew beginning to unsaddle. He was running an inventory, she realized, checking the numbers, assessing the condition of the animals, doing the kind of automatic accounting that a boy does when he has been managing in his father's absence. "Herd looks good," Henry said. And then, as if the admission required balancing, "One of the mares had her foal early. It's fine. They're both fine." "That's good news," Blackwood said. "I know," Henry said. He looked at his boots. I handled it. I know you did, Blackwood said. I got your letter about the fence. Henry looked up. Something crossed his face, quick, and then controlled. It wasn't a big deal. It was a significant repair, Blackwood said. You made the right call. The controlled expression held, but under it something shifted. That involuntary shift that happens to people, children especially, when they hear precisely the recognition they've been needing and hadn't known how to ask for. Just like that. You made the right call, not good job in the general dismissive way. The specific thing. Henry nodded once, looking back at the cattle. Evelyn watched this from where she was standing near the supply wagon, not moving, not drawing attention. She had driven the wagon in with Remy and had been calculating the final supply inventory in her head. What could be returned? What needed restocking? What had been used exactly right? She kept her eyes on the wagon, but she was aware of everything happening in the yard with the complete, quiet attention she always gave to things that mattered. Mrs. Aldrich reached Blackwood, exchanged a few words, took Lillian from his arms with the practiced ease of a woman who had been managing these children for years. Lillian went reluctantly, watching her father over Mrs. Aldrich's shoulder. Then Blackwood looked across the yard at Evelyn. He said something to Mrs. Aldrich, who looked toward the wagon. Then he walked across the yard. Mrs. Aldrich will find you a room in the house, he said, when he reached her. You're welcome to stay as long as you need to arrange your next situation. She looked at him. Your next situation. The language of an employer, careful, at the edge of the crew and the children and Mrs. Aldrich all at various distances. Thank you, she said, equally careful. He held her gaze for a moment, and she could see him working in real time against the context that surrounded them. The crew unsaddling and talking, the children 20 yards away. The housekeeper watching with the alert eyes of a woman who has been running a household long enough to know what she's looking at. I meant what I said on the drive, he said, low. I know, she said. So did I. He nodded. He went back to his crew. The bunkhouse dinner that night was provided by Mrs. Aldrich, a massive, straightforward ranch meal that she delivered with the authority of a woman who had been feeding cowboys on this ranch for over a decade and had opinions about how it was done. Evelyn ate at the main house table, which Mrs. Aldrich set for two because the children had already eaten, with the slight formal awkwardness of a woman who had been a trail cook for 43 days and was now eating off china. She said so, and Mrs. Aldrich, who had a practical face and sharp eyes, and was clearly assessing Evelyn with the thoroughness of a woman who cared about what happened to this household, almost smiled. The china was Clara's choice, Mrs. Aldrich said. I use it because she would have wanted it used. It's lovely, Evelyn said, which was true. Mr. Blackwood mentioned you managed the provisions for the entire drive. I did. And the supply logs. He showed me the accounting. She paused. It was very thorough. Thank you. Mrs. Aldrich poured the coffee and sat down across from her in a way that indicated the assessment was going to continue, which Evelyn accepted because she would have done the same thing in Mrs. Aldrich's position. The children are not easy, Mrs. Aldrich said. Not as a warning, exactly. More as an accurate report. Henry has decided he doesn't need anything, which means he needs a great deal and is not going to ask for it. Lillian sleeps badly and has nightmares, and by morning has usually convinced herself she's fine, and she holds to that very firmly. Mr. Blackwood told me, Evelyn said. He told you. Mrs. Aldrich looked at her with the expression of a woman recalibrating slightly. He doesn't usually tell people about the children. We had 43 days, Evelyn said. Mrs. Aldrich was quiet for a moment, looking at her coffee. Clara was a wonderful woman, she said finally. Not defensively, just placing something on the table between them, the way you place something that has value and that needs to be acknowledged before other things can be discussed. I imagine she was, Evelyn said. From what I understand of her choices, the house site, the china, she was someone who knew what mattered. Mrs. Aldrich looked at her. Something in the older woman's expression settled. Yes, she said, that's exactly right. They ate in a silence that was not unfriendly, and by the end of the meal, Mrs. Aldrich refilled Evelyn's coffee without being asked, which Evelyn took to mean something. She was lying awake in the room Mrs. Aldrich had given her, a small, clean room at the east end of the house with a window that looked toward the pastures. when she heard the footsteps. Small footsteps. The particular soft, irregular pattern of a child trying not to make noise and not entirely succeeding. They stopped outside her door. She waited. A very long pause. Then, a small knock. So quiet it might have been accidental. She got up, pulled her coat around her shoulders, and opened the door. Lillian stood in the hallway in a flannel nightgown, holding a small blanket to her chest. She was dark-haired like her father, with her mother's eyes if Evelyn was guessing correctly. Wide-set, very dark. She looked up at Evelyn with an expression that was trying very hard to be matter-of-fact. "I heard someone in this room," Lillian said. "I wanted to make sure it was a person." Evelyn looked at her. "It is," she said. "It's me. I'm Evelyn." "I know," Lillian said. "Mrs. Aldrich told me." A pause. "She said you drove the cattle with my father." "I cooked for the crew," Evelyn said. "The whole drive." Lillian considered this. "That's a long time to cook." "It is," Evelyn agreed. "I'm tired." Lillian nodded very seriously. "I get tired too," she said. "But then I can't sleep." "I know that kind," Evelyn said. "The tired where sleep doesn't come." Lillian looked at her with sudden, sharp attention. The look of a child who has said something honest about themselves and received understanding rather than dismissal, and who isn't sure yet what to do with that. "Do you want to come in for a minute?" Evelyn said. Lillian looked at the room, at Evelyn, at the room again. "Just a minute," she said, in the tone of someone making clear this was entirely her own idea and she could leave whenever she chose. She came in and sat on the edge of the chair near the window, very upright, blanket in her lap. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed. They looked at each other. "Is the cattle drive scary?" Lillian said. "Parts of it," Evelyn said. "Which parts?" "Storms," Evelyn said. "And there was a fire. And a stampede." Lillian's eyes were very wide. "A stampede?" "Yes." "Were you afraid?" Evelyn thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said, "but I kept moving anyway. Fear doesn't mean you have to stop." Lillian absorbed this the way children absorb things, completely, into a place that would continue processing it long after the conversation ended. "Mrs. Aldrich says I'm brave," Lillian said, "but I think she just says that." "Why?" "Because I cry," Lillian said, very matter-of-factly. "Brave people don't cry." "I cry," Evelyn said. Lillian looked at her with open disbelief. "You redirected a stampede." "I cried after," Evelyn said. Which was true. Not in front of anyone, not until she was alone at the fire much later, but she had, quietly and comprehensively. "Brave people cry all the time. They just also keep moving." Lillian stared at her for a long moment. Then she looked out the window at the dark pastures. "My mother used to sit with me when I couldn't sleep," she said. Very quiet, very straight. "I know," Evelyn said. "Your father told me." Lillian looked at her. Something in the child's face was doing something complicated. Not breaking, nothing so dramatic, but shifting. Moving in the way of a thing that has been held still for a long time and is trying to decide if it's safe to move. "You can stay," Lillian said. "If you want, for a while." Evelyn stayed. She sat in the chair that Lillian had vacated. Lillian had moved to the edge of the bed, wrapping herself in the blanket, and they sat in the quiet room and Evelyn talked, low and steady, about nothing in particular. The drive, the cattle, the stars in Wyoming on a clear October night, the way a fire sounds different in wind than in still air. Small, real things told in a voice calibrated to the particular quality of late night, when what matters is not the content but the sound of someone present. Lillian fell asleep about 20 minutes in, there on the edge of the bed, still upright for a moment, and then gradually sideways until she was simply lying down, the blanket pulled up, breathing steadily. Evelyn sat with her until she was sure, then moved to the chair properly and looked at this child sleeping and thought about all of it. The drive, Blackwood, Harwick, Daniel, the cast-iron skillet she'd left with Mr. Pell, the $11 she'd had in October, the woman who had walked into a cattle camp with her hat in her hands and no letters of reference and a supply of determination that had turned out to be more renewable than she'd expected. She thought about what came next with the particular clear-headedness that comes after a long, sustained effort, when the effort is over, and what remains is the real question. She was not going to be swept into anything. She was not going to confuse gratitude for something more, or loneliness, his or hers, for the foundation of a life. Those were mistakes people made, and they were understandable mistakes, and she was going to be careful with them. But she was also not going to pretend that she didn't know what she knew, that this ranch, these children, this man who managed his grief the way he managed a cattle drive, with competence and without ceremony, that none of this had anything to do with her. It had everything to do with her. She just needed to be sure about it. She would be sure. She had time. Henry found her the next morning. She was in the kitchen at 5 in the morning. She had woken at the usual hour, found the house still, and found the kitchen, and found it well-equipped and well-organized in the way of a housekeeper who had been running it for years. She was making oatmeal with no particular agenda, simply because early mornings required oatmeal, and there was oatmeal, and she was the one awake. Henry appeared in the kitchen doorway at 5:15. He was dressed already, fully, completely, like a person who had been up for a while. He stopped when he saw her, recalibrated, came in anyway. "Mrs. Aldrich usually makes breakfast at 7, he said. "I know," she said. "I was awake." He stood near the table with his hands in his pockets, watching her. He had his father's eyes. Not the color, the quality. The careful, assessing quality. "You were on the drive," he said. "I was." "My father's letters mentioned you," he said. This appeared to be difficult to say, from the way he said it. She looked at him. "What did he say?" "That you prepared for the storm," Henry said, "and fixed the water barrel, and did the supplies." A pause. "And the fire." "Yes," she said. "He doesn't usually put people in his letters," Henry said. "He writes about the drive, the cattle, the terrain, not people." She turned back to the oatmeal, gave it a stir. "Maybe the people were relevant this time," she said. Henry was quiet for a moment. She could feel him thinking, running the same inventory she'd seen him running in the yard the day before. Careful, thorough, not rushing to conclusions. "Are you going to stay?" he said. Blunt. The question of a child who had learned that direct questions sometimes get answers that indirect ones don't. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with a directness that was almost uncomfortable, the directness of a 12-year-old who had decided that the truth was more useful than social comfort. "I don't know yet," she said. "That depends on some things I need to figure out." He considered this. "That's not a no," he said. "No," she said. "It's not." He nodded slowly, processing. Then he said, "Can I have some of that oatmeal?" "Get a bowl," she said. He got a bowl. He sat at the kitchen table and ate, and she sat across from him with her own bowl, and they ate in a silence that was, she thought, not so different from the silence she had sat in with old Cal over 2,000 miles of trail, the silence of two people who were still figuring out what they were to each other, but who had established, at minimum, that they were willing to find out. Outside, the Montana morning was coming up pale and cold over the eastern pastures, the sky doing what the sky here apparently did, arriving slowly, spreading light across the meadow in the way that Clara Blackwood had known it would when she chose this site for the house. Evelyn looked out the window at the meadow and the light, and Henry sat across from her eating oatmeal and not saying anything. And somewhere in the house, Lillian was still sleeping, really sleeping, through the night for once, and Nathaniel Blackwood was in the barn with his horses doing what he did every morning, which she did not know yet but would. She was going to stay. She had known it from somewhere around the 5th day of the drive, maybe earlier, but she had not let herself know she knew it, because knowing too early was dangerous, and she had survived this far by being careful about what she let herself count on. She was still going to be careful. She was going to take it at the pace it needed to be taken, and she was going to be honest about the hard parts. And she was not going to pretend that building something real was anything other than slow, difficult, necessary work. But she was going to stay. She looked back at Henry, who was scraping the last of his oatmeal with the single-minded focus of a 12-year-old who had been making his own breakfast and was now eating something made by someone else, and was not going to admit what that felt like. "It's better with molasses," she said. He looked up. "We have molasses." "I'll find it," she said. He almost smiled. It was brief, and it was controlled, and it was the most unguarded thing she had seen on his face since she'd arrived. She got up to find the molasses. The molasses was in the third cabinet from the left, behind a tin of baking soda and a jar of dried herbs that had likely been there since the previous winter. Evelyn found it in under 2 minutes, which told her something about how her mind worked. She had been in this kitchen for less than an hour, and she had already built a rough map of where things were, the way she built maps of everything, quietly and without deciding to. She set the molasses on the table in front of Henry. He looked at it. He looked at her. He put some in his oatmeal with the careful, non-committal expression of someone conducting an experiment they didn't want to be seen caring about. He ate it, said nothing. But he put a second spoonful of molasses in before the bowl was done, when he thought she wasn't watching. She was always watching. She had just learned a long time ago that the kindest thing you can do with what you observe is choose carefully what to act on and what to let be. December on the Blackwood Ranch arrived with a particular unapologetic severity that the Montana Territory seemed to consider simply normal. The temperature dropped in the first week and kept dropping, the sky closing to a flat white ceiling that sat low over the pastures and pressed the cold down into everything. The horses' breath showed in the mornings. The water in the outdoor trough needed breaking before the cattle could drink. The ranch work did not stop. It never stopped. But it changed in the way of work that has to accommodate weather that has no interest in accommodating it. Evelyn stayed. She had not made a formal declaration of this. She did not sit down with Blackwood and announce her intentions in the manner of a business negotiation. What happened was simpler and more like the way real things happen. Day by day, small decision by small decision, she made herself useful and present and honest. And the ranch absorbed her the way good soil absorbs water, without drama, without resistance. She took over the kitchen from Mrs. Aldrich, not as a displacement, but as a partnership. Mrs. Aldrich, who was 62 and whose knees had been troubling her since September, was relieved in a way she expressed through practical cooperation rather than sentiment. She showed Evelyn the ranch's provisioning system, the supplier accounts, the cold storage, the rhythm of what the household needed and when. Evelyn listened, took notes in the same supply log format she'd used on the drive, and did not change anything for the first 3 weeks. Not because she didn't have ideas, but because she understood that a household is not a camp kitchen, and that the people in it have relationships with the way things are done that need to be understood before they're altered. She wrote to Mr. Pell in Harwick and arranged for the cast iron skillet to be sent north on the freight wagon. When it arrived, wrapped in the same cloth she'd left it in, she set it on the kitchen range and felt something settle in her that she hadn't been able to name until that moment. She was not visiting. She was here. Well, the conversation with Blackwood happened on a Saturday evening in the second week of December, which they both knew had been coming since the 34th night of the drive, and which neither of them had pushed toward, because they were both people who understood that the right moment is not manufactured. The children were asleep. Mrs. Aldrich had retired. The kitchen was clean and the fire in the main room was burning low and steady, and Blackwood came in from checking the barn and found her there with a cup of tea and the household accounts she'd been reviewing, and he sat down across from her without asking if she was busy, because by now they had established the kind of comfortable presence around each other where asking would have felt strange. He looked at the accounts. "You found the error in the September feed costs," he said. "Week of the 14th, she said. "Someone transposed 2 figures. It's a small difference, but it compounds forward." He nodded. He looked at the fire. He looked at her. "Evelyn," he said. She put the accounts down. "I want to say this plainly," he said, "because I'm not good at speaking around things. I'm better at direct." "I know," she said. "I'm the same way." He looked at her with something that was almost a smile. "I know." He paused. "I've been alone for 3 years. The children are here, the ranch is here, the work is constant, but alone in the way I mean." He stopped, started again. "On the drive, I started understanding that I'd gotten used to a version of myself that was smaller than it needed to be. Managed. I've been managing everything, including myself." She waited. She did not fill his pauses, which was something she had learned people needed. The space to find the next true sentence. "I'd like to stop managing," he said. "With you, specifically." He met her eyes directly. "I'd like to know if that's something you want as well. Not because of the ranch, not because of the children, not because you need a situation. Because of you and me and the 43 days we spent getting honest with each other." She looked at him for a moment. Outside, the wind moved across the meadow, and the fire shifted in the grate, and the house was quiet in the particular way of a house with sleeping children, that specific alive quiet. "Yes," she said. "That's what I want." He exhaled, a slow, controlled exhale that nonetheless told her he'd been holding something. "I should tell you," she said, "that I'm not Clara." "I know that," he said immediately. "I mean it in the practical sense," she said. "I don't know what she did, how she ran things, how she was with them. I'm not going to try to be that. I'm going to be what I am." "That's all I'm asking," he said. "It's a significant ask," she said. "Two children who are still grieving, a household with its own history, a man who manages instead of feels until something makes him stop." He took that without flinching, which she respected. "Yes," he said, "all of that." "I can do hard things," she said. "I've established that." "You have," he said. "I need you to be direct with me. When something isn't working, when the children are struggling, when you're struggling, not managed, direct." "I'll try," he said. And then, with the honesty that had become, over 43 days, the thing she trusted most about him. "I'll fail at it sometimes." "I know," she said. "So will I." They sat with that. Two imperfect people in a kitchen in Montana in December, making no promises they couldn't keep and no romantic pronouncements that would feel hollow by February, just the plain agreement of two honest people deciding to try. It was not a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was real. The children were the long work, and she had known that from the beginning. Henry did not warm easily or quickly. He was a 12-year-old boy who had organized his interior life around self-sufficiency. And self-sufficiency, once it becomes identity, does not loosen without resistance. I was not hostile to Evelyn. The oatmeal conversation had established something between them that held, a working truce built on mutual respect for directness and competence. But he was watchful. He maintained his distance the way a person maintains a fence line, not aggressively, just consistently. She did not try to cross it. She honored it. What she did instead was involve him, not in the domestic work of the household. She understood instinctively that asking Henry to come stir the pot would feel to him like being managed, and Henry's deepest resistance was to being managed. She involved him in the things he cared about. She asked him to show her the east pasture fence he'd repaired. He looked at her with suspicion the first time she asked, the suspicion of a child who has learned that adults ask about things as a form of social lubrication and are not actually interested in the answer. But she asked with the same directness she applied to everything, and when he took her to the fence line and explained what he'd done, she asked specific questions about the post depth, about how he'd identified the weak sections, about the technique for stretching wire taught in cold conditions. Real questions, with real follow-up, because she was genuinely interested in the answer. He answered at first in short, clipped sentences. By the end of the fence line, he was talking in paragraphs, with his hands, with the particular animated clarity of someone who knows something well and has been waiting for someone to ask about it properly. Walking back to the house, he said, without looking at her, "My father said you kept a supply log. Every day." "Yes," she said. "He said the math was right every time." "Almost every time," she said. "I caught 2 errors and corrected them." He thought about this. "I make errors sometimes," he said, "in the account books." "So does everyone," she said. "The point isn't to never make them. It's to build a system that catches them." He was quiet for a moment. "Could you show me," he said, "the system?" She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the middle distance with the studied casualness of a 12-year-old making a vulnerable request and attempting to make it look like it didn't matter. "Yes," she said, "after supper." He nodded, very matter-of-fact, as if he'd simply confirmed a logistical arrangement. After supper, she sat with him at the kitchen table and showed him the supply log format and the error-checking system she'd developed over 2 logging summers and 43 days of cattle driving, and he listened with total focus, asking sharp questions that told her how his mind worked. Methodical, pattern-seeking, skeptical of anything he couldn't verify. His father's mind, built differently. At 9 o'clock, when Mrs. Aldrich came through to bank the kitchen fire, she found the two of them arguing with some intensity about the most efficient way to organize a double-entry ledger. and she stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression that she took with her back to her room without showing to either of them. Lillian was a different problem entirely. She did not keep her distance. If anything, Lillian's instinct was the opposite. She moved toward warmth the way any small creature moves toward heat. In winter, without strategy, without defense. The night she'd appeared at Evelyn's door had established something between them that Lillian took as permanent and unconditional in the way children take things when they've been starved enough of them. This was both simpler and harder than Henry. Simpler because Lillian's need was obvious and her willingness to receive what was offered was absolute. She began appearing in the kitchen in the mornings while Evelyn worked, sitting at the table with the particular alertness of a child who wants to be near someone and is trying not to be obvious about it. She asked questions constantly, about the drive, about cooking, about Harwick, about Daniel, the last of which she asked with the direct, unfiltered curiosity of an 8-year-old who did not yet understand that some questions landed differently. "Were you sad when he died?" she asked one morning, sitting at the kitchen table, watching Evelyn make bread. "Yes," Evelyn said. "Very." "Are you still sad?" She thought about this honestly, the way she tried to think about everything. "Sometimes," she said. "Not the same way. More like, I carry it differently now. It's still there. It's just not the first thing I feel every morning." Lillian was quiet for a moment, tracing a pattern on the table with one finger. "I still feel it every morning," she said. "I know," Evelyn said. "That's normal. And it changes, but on its own schedule, not one you can hurry." Lillian looked up. "Mrs. Aldrich says it gets easier." "It does," Evelyn said. "But Mrs. Aldrich is also the kind of person who wants to reassure you, so she might be rounding up a little." Lillian stared at her. Then, startlingly, she laughed. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded. The laugh of a child who has been given an honest answer when they expected a comfortable one. The harder part was this. Lillian's need was so great and so obvious that Evelyn had to be careful not to fill it too fast. A child who has been hungry doesn't benefit from being given everything at once. And Evelyn was aware, with the particular clarity of someone who had been careful about her own needs for a very long time, that she could not allow herself to become the thing Lillian organized her entire emotional life around. That was not good for Lillian, and it was not sustainable for Evelyn, and it was not what a child needed. What Lillian needed was to learn, slowly and through accumulated evidence, that the people in her life were going to stay. So Evelyn stayed. Not dramatically, just daily, just consistently. She was in the kitchen in the mornings, and she sat with Lillian when she couldn't sleep, and she showed up to the small moments, the homework, the torn hem on the winter dress, the evening when Lillian brought home a stray cat from the barn and presented it with the confidence of someone who had not yet asked permission and was betting that the presentation would be sufficiently compelling to make the question moot. Evelyn looked at the cat, which was orange and unattractive and clearly of the opinion that it now lived indoors. She looked at Lillian. "Does it have a name?" she said. "Not yet," Lillian said, slightly breathless with the gamble. "Give it one," Evelyn said, "and it stays in the kitchen." Lillian named it Marshall. Marshall was a terrible cat, bad-tempered and deeply affectionate in alternating intervals, and within 2 weeks he had become the subject of at least 3 household arguments about whose lap he preferred and why. Henry pretended to have no opinion about Marshall while consistently seeking him out in the evenings and telling no one about it. Evelyn noticed. She told no one about it either. But Blackwood was learning to stop managing. It was not a smooth process. He was a man who had been running things, the ranch, the drives, his children, his grief, through organization and forward momentum, and the habit was deep. There were evenings when she could see him retreating behind it, going quiet in the particular way of someone who has something real to say and is reaching for the operational version instead. When this happened, she waited. She had infinite patience for the specific kind of silence that was a person trying to find their way to something honest. She had almost no patience for the silence that was someone deciding the honest thing was too inconvenient. The difference mattered, and she knew the difference, and he was learning to trust that she knew it. One evening in January, he came in from the barn later than usual and sat down in the kitchen without taking his coat off, which meant his mind was somewhere else. She poured coffee, set it in front of him, went back to what she was doing. After a long while, he said, "I've been thinking about Clara." She turned to look at him. "Not in a... I've been thinking about something she said to me," he said, "before she got sick. She said she worried that I'd outlast her and not know how to be anything but the ranch." He looked at his coffee. "She knew me very well." "She did," Evelyn said, evenly. "Not threatened, just honest." "I want you to know," he said, "that what I feel for you is not... I'm not filling a space. I know the difference." She looked at him for a moment. "I know you do," she said. "You're not a man who does things he hasn't thought about." "I've thought about it a great deal," he said, with a wryness that was still new on him, still finding its way to the surface. "Possibly too much." "There's no too much," she said. "Think as much as you need to. Just don't use thinking as a substitute for the thing itself." He looked at her. "You're very precise." "Someone has to be," she said, "when you're being vague." He almost laughed. It was still startling to her, that sound. Not because it was rare, though it was, but because of what it cost him, which was the careful management he usually kept in place. When Blackwood laughed, something real was happening. She had come to value it accordingly. The spring came slowly, the way Montana springs do. Not a clean arrival, but a gradual loosening, the snow retreating first from the south-facing slopes, and then reluctantly from everywhere else, the pastures emerging muddy and then green beneath it. On a morning in March, Evelyn stood on the front porch of the house in the lower meadow and watched the light come across the east pastures the way Clara Blackwood had apparently watched it every morning from this same spot. She had not planned to think about Clara in this moment. But the light did what the light did, and it was easy to understand why someone would choose this meadow, this view, this house. She was not Clara. She had said so, and meant it. But she was beginning to understand that being in a place where someone you'd never met had made good decisions was not a haunting. It was more like inheriting something, the evidence of someone else's wisdom left in the site of a house and the arrangement of a kitchen and two children who, whatever their grief, were also evidence of something that had been done right. Blackwood came out to stand beside her. He had been up since before her, which was unusual. He was normally a pre-dawn riser who she beat to the kitchen by virtue of old habit, but this morning she'd found the coffee already made and him at the barn. "Something wrong with the mare?" she said, because the mare who'd foaled early was still a concern. "No," he said. "She's good. Foal is good." He stood beside her and looked at the meadow. "I woke up at 3 and couldn't sleep." She looked at him. He was looking at the light on the pastures. "I kept thinking," he said, "about the 34th night of the drive." He paused. "When I said I wanted to have a different conversation after the drive was over." "I remember," she said. "I should have said more than I said," he said. "On that night and after. I should have been clearer." She waited. He turned to look at her. In the early morning light, with his guard down, he looked very much like the tired, honest man she'd first seen sitting on the crate by the fire on the 34th night, the man underneath the cattle king. "I love you," he said, plainly, with the same directness he used for everything that mattered. "I should have said that by now. I was managing again." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the cast-iron skillet and the $3 and the town of Harwick, deciding what she was before she'd had a chance to say. She thought about the 2-room house she'd shared with Daniel, the 14 months of showing up and meaning it, and then the hollow months after. She thought about Colton Vane's slow clapping and the look on Blackwood's face the first day she'd met him, that careful expression that didn't decide too fast. She thought about Lillian sleeping through the night and Henry arguing about ledgers and a bad-tempered orange cat named Marshall who had attached himself to the household with more confidence than he'd been offered. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." He looked at her. "You didn't say anything." "I was waiting for you to stop managing," she said. He exhaled, that slow, controlled exhale that was his version of relief. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood there on the porch in the early March light, looking at the pastures that Clara had chosen and that Evelyn was now standing in, together in the plain, unceremonious way of two people who have already done the hard work and are only now getting around to naming what it was. She did not think of herself as having been rescued. This was important to her in a way that was not about pride but about accuracy. She had walked into a cattle camp in October with $11 and a skill set that nobody had thought to value, and she had done the work, and the work had built the life. Nathaniel Blackwood had offered her a place, but a place is not a rescue. A place is an opportunity, and what you do with an opportunity is entirely your own. She had seen women on the frontier who waited to be rescued and spent their whole lives waiting. She had also seen women who needed rescue and received it and were grateful, and that was fine too. There was no shame in needing rescue. The shame was only in pretending you didn't need it when you did, or pretending you'd been rescued when you'd rescued yourself. She had rescued herself. She did not require anyone to acknowledge this. She knew it, and the knowing of it was solid ground, and solid ground was what you built everything else on. What Blackwood had given her was not rescue. He had given her the thing she'd been working toward without knowing what to call it. A situation in which her particular qualities were not a problem to be managed, but a foundation to build from. He had given her children who needed exactly what she had to give, and a household that needed exactly what she knew how to do, and a man who was learning to be honest rather than managed, which was slow and imperfect and real. She had given him things too. She knew this without being sentimental about it. She had given him the conversation about Henry that had unlocked something. You made the right call, the specific thing, the thing that only works when you've been paying attention. She had given Lillian the honest answer when the comfortable one would have been easier. She had given the ranch a woman who did not wait to be told what needed doing, who woke before dawn. Not out of duty, but out of constitution, who kept supply logs and corrected errors and made oatmeal with molasses and stayed. Staying was the thing. It was always the thing. She had not understood this fully in October, in Harwick, sitting on the cot above Mr. Pell's feed store. She had understood survival. She was good at survival, had been her whole life. But survival and staying were different, and she had only begun to understand staying when she was on the trail, watching 32 men whose skepticism became familiarity, became something that looked, at the end, a great deal like respect. You stayed. You did the work. You paid attention. You prepared for storms when the sky was still clear. And eventually, not always, not with everyone, but enough, people who had decided what you were before they knew anything found themselves revising. Not because you'd argued them into it, because you'd made it impossible to hold the old story with any honesty. Henry came to her in late March with the ledger. He'd been keeping it himself since the January evening at the kitchen table, with the system she'd shown him and some modifications of his own that were, she had to admit, improvements. He set it in front of her now with the expression he used when he was presenting something he'd put significant effort into and was attempting not to appear to care about the response. She went through it. She took her time. She found one error, pointed it out, showed him where the correction needed to go. She found 3 places where his modifications to the system were genuinely better than her original approach, and she said so specifically, the way he had taught her he needed. Not good job in the broad, patting way, but this is better because here is why. He absorbed this. He took the ledger back. I want to learn the drive provisioning, he said, for next fall. She looked at him. He was nearly 13 now. In 2 years, he'd be helping run the drive itself. All right, she said. We'll start after spring roundup. He nodded. He went to put the ledger away. At the kitchen door, he stopped and did not turn around. I'm glad you stayed, he said to the door frame. Very quiet. Matter of fact. The voice of a 12-year-old who had decided the honest thing was more useful than the safe thing, because someone in his life had been showing him that for 4 months. She looked at his back, at the door frame, at the Montana morning beyond the window. So am I, she said. He went. She sat at the kitchen table for a moment, alone in the kitchen, with the cast iron skillet on the range and the supply log on the table, and Marshall the cat arranged on the windowsill in a stripe of pale March sunlight, and outside somewhere, Lillian's voice rising from the direction of the barn, calling something to her father that Evelyn couldn't quite hear. She listened to the sound of it. The house around her, alive with the ordinary sounds of ordinary morning, a 12-year-old's footsteps on the floor above, a man's voice answering his daughter from the barn, the fire talking to itself in the grate, the skillet warming, the world going about its business. She had once been a woman with nothing. She still was, in some ways. She had not forgotten what nothing felt like, and she did not intend to. You don't forget the weight of $3 and a skillet and a town that has looked at you and decided. You carry it, but differently over time, the way she had told Lillian grief works. Not gone, just rearranged into something that doesn't take up the whole morning. What she had built was not a rescue story. It was not the story of a woman saved by the right man at the right time. It was the story of a woman who had paid attention her entire life, who had treated competence as its own answer, who had walked into a cattle camp and done the work until the work was undeniable. The love and the children and the house in the meadow were real. She was not minimizing them, but they had come to her because she had shown up, had kept showing up, through the laughter on the first day, and the 31 days of proving, and the fire, and the stampede, and the 9 careful days after. She had shown up, and the rest had followed, the way good things usually follow sustained, unglamorous, necessary work. That was the whole of it, really. The lesson she had not been trying to teach, and that she had learned alongside everyone else, somewhere in the long middle of 43 days north. That the frontier did not care what you deserved. It cared what you did. And what you did, done consistently and honestly and without waiting for someone to notice, became the life you were living before you understood that was what was happening. She got up and started breakfast. The morning came on over the east pastures, the same as it always had and would, wide and cold and indifferent to the smallness of any individual life passing through it. Somewhere in that light, a ranch was waking up. A man was coming in from the barn. A girl was running across the yard with a cat named Marshall tucked under her arm. A boy was sitting at a desk upstairs with a ledger, learning a system, making it better. And in the kitchen, a woman who had once been called the widow nobody wanted was making oatmeal with molasses. In the house in the meadow that someone with good judgment had chosen for exactly this light, at exactly this hour, for exactly this kind of ordinary,